good evening, or good morning, or maybe it's one of those hours that doesn't really belong to either. Before we begin, feel free to settle in wherever you are. If you'd like to gently support the channel, you can like the video or subscribe, but only if it feels right. No pressure at all. And if you're comfortable, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always enjoy seeing how far these quiet moments travel. Now, there's nothing you need to prepare for tonight. No facts to remember, no conclusions waiting at the end. Just a slow walk through something ordinary that was never meant to be permanent. Let's begin with something very small. A child sleeping, not in a crib, not in a quiet room, just somewhere nearby. Maybe on a pallet of straw, maybe wrapped tightly in cloth, maybe close enough to the hearth that warmth could be borrowed without asking. No one planned it this way. It wasn't a philosophy of parenting. It wasn't a tradition written down. It was simply the easiest way to keep a small body warm while everyone else tried to survive the night. And that's how most things started. In medieval households, nothing existed because it was ideal. Things existed because they worked. For now, a mother wraps her infant tightly, not because she wants to restrict movement, but because the baby needs to stay warm while she works. Just for today, just until morning, just until the fire dies down. But tomorrow looks exactly the same, and so does the next week, and eventually the next generation. What began as a temporary solution quietly becomes the way it's done. Swaddling turns into expectation, expectation turns into judgment, and judgment turns into memory. Years later, no one remembers why children were wrapped so tightly. They only remember that children are wrapped that way. And already, the line between care and danger is thin, because the same cloth that keeps a child warm can also keep them too warm. The same stillness that allows adults to work can also hide the moment something goes wrong. But no one is watching closely enough to notice. Not because they don't care, but because there is bread to bake, water to fetch, animals to keep alive. And this is something important to understand, though no one ever says it out loud. Medieval childhood was not neglected. It was competed with. Every day, a child's needs quietly stood in line behind survival. Not maliciously, not cruelly, just practically. If a baby cried, someone would try to quiet them. If a toddler wandered too close to the fire, someone might pull them back. But if no one noticed in time, that was not considered a tragedy in the way we mean it now. It was considered unfortunate. Unfortunate things happened often, and so people learned, without discussing it, to keep going. Children learnt this too, very early. By the time a child could walk steadily, they were already learning how not to die. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, observational way. They learned which parts of the house were warm and which parts burned, which animals kicked, which water was safe, and which water pulled people under without warning. No one gathered them together to explain these rules. There were no lessons. There was only repetition. A child watched another child fall. A child watched an adult scold someone else too late. A child learned without being taught. And then there is hunger. Not famine, not disaster, just the soft, ordinary kind of hunger that lives between meals. In many households, food was not absent. It was simply measured. Adults needed strength to work. Older children needed strength to help. Smaller children needed whatever was left. This wasn't a decision anyone sat down to make. It happened naturally, invisibly. If the pot was thin, it stayed thin. If the bread was small, it was broken carefully. And when children were weaned slowly, quietly, sometimes too early, it wasn't because someone thought it was best. It was because milk doesn't stretch. Weaning, in theory, is a milestone. In practice, it was a gamble. Soft bread, soaked in liquid, thin porridge made from whatever grain was available, milk that had been diluted just enough, enough to seem helpful, enough to be dangerous, because water was everywhere, and clean water was not. A child could survive infancy, only to meet the real test months later, when their body was no longer protected by what it had borrowed from its mother. And when children became ill, care did not disappear. It simply stayed limited. A warm place, a blanket, a prayer, a promise made to a saint whose name the child would never know. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, and life continued around the body either way. What's strange if you sit with it long enough is how little of this feels dramatic. There is no single villain here, no moment where things obviously go wrong, just a series of reasonable choices stacking quietly on top of each other. And that pattern repeats in sleeping, in feeding, in watching children near water, in letting older siblings mind younger ones because someone has to. Always temporary, always practical, always becoming permanent. And we haven't even left the house yet. Eventually, a child leaves the warmth of the house, not ceremoniously, not all at once, just more often. At first, it's an errand, a small one. Carry this, fetch that, watch the pot while I'm gone. No one calls it responsibility. It's simply helpful. And helpfulness in a medieval household is a dangerous thing, because once a child proves they can do something without immediately dying, they are expected to do it again and again. Soon, the child knows the path to the well better than they know the inside of the house. They know how slippery the stones are after rain. They know which bucket leaks and which rope burns your hands if you pull too fast. No one explains this. They learn it by watching someone else fall, or by falling themselves and surviving. Water, especially, is everywhere. It's life. It's work. It's also quiet. A well does not shout. A river does not warn. Children learn this too. They learn that water looks calm until it isn't. That edges are closer than they appear. That depth changes without notice. And still they are sent back. Because the household needs water tomorrow as well. In towns, water runs where people do not expect children to be, in ditches, along streets, through narrow channels meant to carry waste away from places people eat. Children play near them. They walk beside them. They cross them because it's faster. No one fenced these places, not because people didn't care, but because fencing water everywhere would mean fencing life itself. So instead, people learn to live with loss. Quietly, if a child fell in, neighbors gathered. Someone pulled the body out. Someone said a prayer. And the water kept moving. This is one of the hardest things to sit with, not the danger itself, but the way it blended into daily life. A medieval child didn't live around risk. They lived inside it. Fire was no different. The hearth was the center of the home. Warmth, light, food, and danger. Children crawled where sparks landed. They learned quickly which parts of the floor were hot and which were only warm. They watched adults reach into flames without flinching. They tried to copy them. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Burns were common enough to be unremarkable. Serious burns were mourned and then absorbed into memory like everything else. There was no safe room, no child-proof corner. Because the house was not built for children, it was built for survival, and survival meant fire stayed where it was most useful, not where it was safest. Animals lived close too, not out of affection though that existed, but because animals were valuable. A cow was warmth, milk, labor, wealth. A horse was power. A dog was protection. Children learned which animals tolerated clumsy hands and which did not. They learned by watching ears flatten, by hearing hooves strike the ground harder than usual. Sometimes they learned too late. But again, no one redesigned the household because the animal needed to stay. And the child, if they survived, learned. This is where something subtle begins to happen. By the time a child reaches what we might think of as early childhood, they are no longer treated as fragile, not because they aren't, but because fragility is no longer useful. A child who can walk can help. A child who can speak can be sent. A child who can remember can be trusted. Trusted with small dangers, and danger scales quietly. One task becomes two. One errand becomes a habit. An older sibling watches a younger one not because it's ideal, but because someone has to. Just for an hour, just until I get back. But hours stretch, and just this once becomes routine. Children raising children. No one names it. It simply happens, and sometimes it works beautifully. Older children develop an awareness that feels almost adult. They learn to soothe, to distract, to prevent. Other times, they miss something, a moment, a sound, and then, suddenly, everything stops. Except life. This is not a world without care. It's a world where care is distributed thinly across too many needs. When illness comes, and it always does, it rarely arrives alone. A cough becomes many coughs. A fever passes from one body to another, quietly. Rooms are small. Air is shared. Smoke lingers. Children breathe what adults breathe. They eat what adults eat, just less of it. And when a child weakens, care narrows. Warmth first, then food, then prayer. Sometimes there is a promise. If they live, I will. Promises were common. They didn't always come true. Not because people forgot, but because life moved faster than vows. And still, people tried again with the next child, because having children was not a choice in the way we understand it. It was continuity. And continuity required acceptance of loss. Slowly, almost without noticing, childhood shortens. A child who survives long enough begins to work, not formally, not announced. They help in fields. They mind animals. They carry. Work is introduced the same way danger was quietly, gradually, without ceremony. Just for today, just to help. And before anyone realizes it, the child is no longer a child. They are simply smaller. At some point, a child stops belonging entirely to the household they were born into. Not emotionally, not completely, but practically. Sometimes they are sent away, not because they are unwanted, but because mouths are many and bread is not. A neighbor needs help. A craftsman needs an extra pair of hands. A household with fewer children can afford one more body. It sounds transactional because it is. but it's rarely spoken that way. Instead, it's framed as opportunity. They'll learn something, they'll be fed, they'll be safer there, and sometimes they are. Other times, they are simply relocated danger. A child sent into service learns new rules very quickly. Rules that are not written down. Don't break things. Don't talk too much. Don't take food unless you're told. Sleep where you're told to sleep. Wake when others wake. And most importantly, don't complain, because complaining suggests weakness. And weakness suggests you might be sent somewhere worse. So, children adapt. They adapt faster than adults expect, faster than adults notice. They learn how to disappear into work, how to make themselves useful enough to stay. This is not cruelty in the way we imagine it. It's a system that rewards silence, and silence keeps children alive, at least for a while. In workshops, danger takes a different shape. Knives are sharper than toys ever were. Fire is hotter. Mistakes are louder. But children learn quickly which mistakes are allowed. A cut can be hidden. A burn can be explained. Breaking something valuable is different. So they move carefully. They watch. They imitate. And when they succeed, no one celebrates. Because success is expected. Failure is the only thing that draws attention. In these places, childhood doesn't end abruptly. It thins. It becomes something you carry quietly, like a scar under clothing. Some children are bound formally. Apprenticeships, terms, years, agreements made between adults that shape the rest of a small life. The language is clean, orderly, training, discipline, provision, but behind it is the same familiar logic. This works. This feeds people. This keeps things moving. If a child survives this system, it is seen as proof that the system is good. Those who do not survive are rarely counted. And still, the world keeps building around children who are not there anymore. Back in the household, or what remains of it, new children are born, and the cycle begins again, wrapped, fed carefully, watched imperfectly. It's tempting to imagine that people would have done things differently if they'd known better. But most of the time, they did know. They knew water was dangerous. They knew fire burned. They knew illness spread. They just didn't have alternatives. You can't fence every well. You can't extinguish every hearth. You can't stop sending children where work exists. So instead, society grows thicker, layered. Institutions appear. At first, they are simple. A place to leave a child for the night. A doorway that is always open. A bell that can be rung anonymously. No one intends for this to become normal. It's meant for emergencies, for shame, for desperation. But desperation is more common than anyone likes to admit. And soon the system grows. A building, a staff, a routine. Infants are received, named, fed, sometimes nursed, sometimes not well enough. These places save lives, and they lose lives, often at the same time. Once a system exists, people adjust their behavior around it. A mother who might have kept a child now has another option. A household under strain now has a release valve. The system absorbs the pressure and quietly encourages more of it. No one calls this failure. They call it charity. And charity, like everything else, adapts to demand. Inside these institutions, children are safe from some dangers, but not all. Disease loves density, and care, when stretched thin, becomes routine. Feed, wash, move on. Children who survive long enough may be sent out again, into service, into work. The institution feeds the labor system that fed it in the first place. A loop so efficient no one notices it turning. And through all of this, what's missing is not love. It's margin. There is no extra space for error, no buffer for curiosity, no room for prolonged innocence. Every solution works just well enough until it doesn't. And then another solution appears. Temporary, improvised, destined to last. Illness rarely arrived alone. It drifted in quietly, on breath, on hands, on shared cups and shared blankets. A child would cough, then another. No one panicked at the first sound. Coughs were common. Fevers came and went. You waited. Waiting was a skill. You watched the color of the skin, the way the chest moved, how quickly the child tired. If they ate, that was good. If they slept, that was better. If they stopped doing either, then attention sharpened. Care, when it came, was gentle but limited. Warmth was always the first response. More cloth, closer to the fire. Food followed if the child could take it. Thin broth, soft bread, and then time. People did not hover. They couldn't. Someone still had to fetch water. Someone still had to work. So illness unfolded alongside everything else. Sometimes a child recovered quickly, so quickly that it felt almost miraculous. Other times the decline was slow, slow enough that it became part of the background. A child lying quietly in the corner while the household moved around them. Careful not to step too close, careful not to hope too much. And when death came, it did not announce itself. There was no sudden shift in the air, no clear boundary, just a moment when breathing did not return. People noticed. They always noticed, but they noticed the way you notice something you expected. Grief was real, but it had a shape. It was compact. There were no long pauses, no weeks of withdrawal. The body was prepared. The prayers were said. And then the day continued. Because it had to. This is one of the hardest things to accept when looking back. Not that medieval people felt less, but that they could not afford to feel longer. Loss was frequent enough that survival required compression. Emotion learned to fold itself. And children learned this too. Those who survived learned not to ask where someone went. They learned not to linger on absence. They noticed empty places, of course. A spot by the hearth, a shared blanket that was no longer shared. But they did not stop, because stopping was dangerous. Soon, another child would take that place, not intentionally, just naturally. New births did not wait for grief to clear, and so childhood continued in layers. Some children learned early that survival was quiet, that drawing attention to yourself was risky. Others learned the opposite, that being useful was protection. If you carried water well, you were needed. If you worked steadily, you stayed. In a world without guarantees, usefulness was safety. Even play adapted. Children did not stop playing, but play folded itself around work. Games happened near tasks. Songs were sung while walking. Laughter existed, but it was brief, because there was always something else to do. And danger never fully left the frame. It hovered near water, near animals, near fire. A moment of distraction could undo years of careful survival, which is why, over time, adults began to expect more awareness from children. Earlier, they expected them to know better. to move carefully, to notice risks. And when a child failed to do so, the failure felt personal, as if the child should have known. This is where something subtle shifts. Responsibility moves downward. Children are not protected from danger. They are expected to manage it. A child who survives learns to anticipate outcomes, to read spaces, to sense when something is about to go wrong. And this skill, this quiet vigilance, becomes a kind of maturity, not celebrated, just assumed. By the time a child reaches an age we might still call young, they are already seasoned. They have seen illness. They have seen death. They have watched systems work and fail. They know which promises mean something and which are made only because words are expected. They know that care exists, but it is finite. This understanding shapes everything that follows. When they are sent into service, they do not expect fairness. When they are bound to work, they do not expect gentleness. They expect continuity, food, shelter, routine. Anything beyond that feels like generosity. And sometimes, rarely, there is generosity, a kind master, a household that feeds well, a place where danger is slightly reduced. These moments stand out, not because they are dramatic, but because they are unexpected, and children remember them, not with gratitude, but with caution, because they know how quickly conditions change. A household prospers, then falters. A master ages, a war shifts everything, and suddenly the rules are different again. This is why medieval childhood never settles. It is always provisional, always adapting, always one step behind whatever crisis is coming next. And still, children are born, wrapped, fed, watched, temporarily safe. War, when it came, rarely announced itself to children. It arrived indirectly, through absence, a father gone longer than usual, a brother not returning at all, a field left untilled because there were not enough hands. Children did not hear speeches about conflict. They noticed smaller things. Less bread, thinner soup, more tension in voices that tried to stay calm. War changed routines before it ever touched walls. And routines were everything. When routines broke, children felt it first. Because adults could compensate for a while, children could not. Food was stretched, tasks multiplied. Older children took on work meant for those who were gone. Younger children were expected to understand, even if they didn't. And sometimes war didn't need to come close. Just the rumor of it was enough. Markets reacted. Prices rose. Grain moved elsewhere. And suddenly, the careful balance that had kept a household afloat tipped. Not dramatically, quietly. The pot was filled with more water than grain. Meals became predictable and smaller. No one announced that times were hard. Children figured it out when they were told to eat slowly. Famine was rarely a single event. It was a season that lingered, a stretch of months where nothing was quite enough. In these times, childhood thinned even further. Play disappeared almost entirely, not because it was forbidden, but because it felt inappropriate. A child who played while others worked felt exposed, and exposure was dangerous. Children learned to read the mood of a room, to know when silence was safer than noise. They learned to wait. Waiting was another skill. Waiting for food, waiting for news, waiting for someone to return. Sometimes the waiting ended. Sometimes it didn't. And when it didn't, life adjusted again. Orphans were absorbed where possible, by relatives, by neighbors, sometimes by institutions, sometimes by no one. An orphaned child did not stop being useful. In fact, usefulness often increased. They could be placed, moved, assigned, without negotiation, without sentiment. Their survival depended entirely on fitting into someone else's system, which meant learning new rules quickly. Children became experts at adaptation, not because they wanted to be, but because they had to. They learned how to make themselves smaller when needed, how to be visible when it helped. They learned when to speak, and when silence protected them more. This constant adjustment had an effect. It created children who were observant, alert, cautious, not fragile, but not carefree either. And still, childhood was not joyless. There were moments, always moments, a shared joke during work, a song remembered from earlier years. Laughter happened, but it never stayed long, because laughter draws attention, and attention in a crowded, risky world is unpredictable. Children who survived into adolescence carried all of this with them. By then, danger felt familiar. They did not see the world as hostile. They saw it as conditional. If you do this, you survive. If you forget that, you might not. And so rules formed, unwritten, unspoken. Rules about where you stand, where you walk, what you touch. Rules learned through repetition, not instruction. These rules passed quietly from child to child, not as lessons, as habits. This is how systems lasted, not because they were enforced, but because they were absorbed. A child who grew up this way did not think of their childhood as harsh. It was simply normal, because they knew no alternative. Safety was not an expectation. It was an outcome, sometimes achieved, sometimes not. And this understanding followed them into adulthood. They became parents who wrapped their children tightly, who sent them to fetch water early, who trusted them near fire sooner than felt comfortable, not because they wanted to, but because that was how survival had worked. Temporary solutions remembered as wisdom, improvisations passed down as tradition, and children born into it all again, wrapped, fed, watched, just enough. There was a moment quiet, unmarked, when a child was expected to understand. No one announced it. No bell rang. No ceremony took place. It simply became clear that certain mistakes were no longer forgiven. A spilled pot that once brought laughter now brought irritation. A forgotten errand no longer earned patience. Something had shifted. The child might not know the words for it, but they felt it immediately. They were supposed to know better now. This expectation didn't come from cruelty. It came from necessity. In a world where systems were fragile, everyone had to carry weight as early as possible, and so responsibility slid downward. Age was less important than capability, and capability was measured harshly. If you could remember, you were responsible. If you could carry, you were needed. This is why age feels blurry in medieval life. A child of 7 might still be small, but they were not considered unaware. They were expected to notice danger, to anticipate outcomes. If something went wrong, the question wasn't always, why did this happen? Sometimes it was simply, why didn't you see it coming? This way of thinking settled in quietly. Children absorbed it the same way they absorbed everything else, through repetition, through watching what happened to others. A child who was careless learned quickly, either through correction or consequence. And consequences were rarely abstract. They were physical, immediate, a burn, a fall, a scolding that lingered longer than comfort. This taught children not just caution but restraint. Don't move too fast. Don't draw attention. Don't test things unnecessarily. Curiosity survived, but it learned to disguise itself. Children still explored. They just did it carefully. They learned which questions were safe, which ones weren't. They learned that some knowledge came at a cost. And this shaped the way they thought. By adolescence, many children were already experienced navigators of risk. They knew when a situation felt unstable, when a household might fail. They recognized hunger before it became visible. They knew the signs because they had lived through them before. This early familiarity with instability made them adaptable, but it also made them cautious. They trusted systems only partially. They relied on routines, but kept watch for cracks. This mindset followed them into work, into service, into marriage, into parenthood. And so the cycle continued. A child who had learned early that safety was temporary became an adult who prepared for loss instinctively. They wrapped their own children tightly, not because it felt good, but because it felt safer. They sent children out early, not because they wanted to shorten childhood, but because waiting felt dangerous. Time, in this world, was not something you eased into. It pressed. Always. Even joy felt provisional. A good harvest brought relief, but not relaxation. A healthy child brought gratitude, but not certainty. Everything good carried the awareness of how quickly it could change. And children grew up breathing that awareness. They didn't think of it as anxiety. It was simply attentiveness. The habit of watching, the habit of preparing, the habit of accepting that nothing lasts very long in one form, which is why medieval childhood leaves so little behind. Few objects, few records, because it was never meant to linger. It was something you passed through quickly if you survived, and if you didn't, the world adjusted. Quietly, another child would fill the space. Another routine would continue, not out of indifference, but because stopping would threaten everyone else. And so the systems endured, not because they were gentle, but because they worked just well enough. And children, always at the edge of those systems, learned to live inside them. Later, much later, a child who survived long enough becomes someone who watches, not carefully at first, almost without noticing. They watch a small body sleep the way they once slept, wrapped, still, and something unfamiliar happens. They feel relief and unease at the same time, because they remember, not clearly, not in scenes, but in sensations. The weight of cloth, the closeness of heat, the way stillness felt like safety and also like danger. So they adjust, just slightly. They loosen the wrap a little, then tighten it again. They move the child closer to the fire, then pull them back. Nothing feels exact, because nothing ever was. They don't explain this to anyone. They wouldn't know how. They only know that they are repeating something that once worked, and hoping quietly that it still will. They feed the child carefully. At first, there is no problem. Milk is enough. But time moves. It always does. Soon, the child needs more. And the old calculations return. How much grain is left? How thin can the food be without becoming dangerous? They remember thin food. They remember hunger that wasn't called hunger. So they hesitate. Just a little. But hesitation has a cost too, because children grow whether conditions are ready or not, and eventually the same decision appears. When to stop nursing, when to introduce something else. It is never the perfect moment. It is simply the moment that arrives. They tell themselves it will be fine, because it was fine last time, or because they survived, which in this world counts as proof. They watch closely, too closely. They notice every cough, every pause. They remember waiting, and they hate waiting now. But waiting is still all there is. When illness comes, they do not panic. They cannot afford to. They do what was done for them: warmth, food, time. They promise things again, not because they believe promises change outcomes, but because promises make waiting feel less empty. And sometimes the child recovers, and the relief is sharp enough to feel dangerous. Because relief invites hope, and hope, if indulged too long, can make the next loss unbearable. So they temper it. They smile, but briefly. They thank whoever they believe listens. And then they return to routine. Routine is safety. Children sense this. They grow up in households where emotions are measured, where joy exists but does not spill, where grief is acknowledged but contained. They learn not to demand attention. They learn that being easy to care for is a kind of skill, and this skill keeps them alive. When the child grows older, the watching reverses. Now, the child watches the adult. They see how decisions are made, quietly, quickly, without discussion. They learn that safety is something you manage, not something you expect. So when they are sent out to fetch water, to carry, to work, they go. They don't argue, not because they don't feel fear, but because fear is familiar, and familiar things are manageable. They know where danger lives, near edges, near heat, near animals. They don't avoid these places. They navigate them carefully, and when they stumble, when they make a mistake, they don't assume rescue will arrive instantly. They try to correct it themselves. This is one of the quiet legacies of medieval childhood. Children learn early that help is not guaranteed. It may come, it often does, but it is not immediate. So self-reliance grows early. Not the heroic kind, the practical kind, the kind that says, if I can fix this myself, I should. This makes children appear older than they are, more capable, more composed, and adults respond to this appearance. They trust children more, they assign more, which reinforces the cycle. Responsibility creates competence. Competence invites responsibility, and the margin never widens. It stays thin, always. This is why medieval childhood feels so narrow when we look back. It has no room to expand, no protected space, just a corridor between birth and usefulness. Some children move through it quickly, some do not make it at all, and the world, indifferent but not cruel, continues to function. Because it has learned how. When explanations were needed, they were rarely elaborate. No one sat children down to explain why some lived and others didn't. Explanations were absorbed the same way everything else was, through repetition, through phrases overheard, through habits that carried meaning without spelling it out. It was God's will. It was fate. It was meant to be. These were not dramatic statements. They were practical ones. They helped people stand up the next morning. They allowed hands to return to work. And because they worked, they stayed. At first, these explanations were comforts. They softened grief, just enough to make it survivable. But over time, they became something else. They became structure. If death was part of a larger order, then questioning it felt unnecessary, even dangerous. Children learned this quickly. They learned which questions ended conversations, which ones made adults look away. So curiosity learned to turn inward. A child might wonder why a friend didn't wake up, why a baby disappeared, but they learned not to ask directly. Instead, they watched. They noticed patterns. Certain seasons were worse. Certain illnesses returned. Certain children, small, quiet, already thin, were more likely to be gone. No one said this aloud, but children understood, and understanding without language is a heavy thing. It settles in the body. This is where habit begins to replace explanation. If something happened often enough, it no longer needed a reason. It was simply how things were. This is why medieval societies did not constantly reinvent childhood. They adapted around its fragility instead. They built customs that assumed loss, naming children after dead siblings, not growing attached too quickly, waiting before celebrating survival. These weren't signs of coldness. They were signs of experience. People learned where hope was safe and where it was not. Children sensed this too. They learned not to expect permanence. A good situation was appreciated, but never assumed to last. This shaped how relationships formed. Friendships were close, but flexible. Attachments were deep, but quiet. Children didn't stop loving. They just loved with restraint, because restraint hurt less when things changed. And things always changed. This way of living did something subtle to time. Time stopped feeling expansive. There was no long horizon. There was only what needed doing now and soon. Children lived in that narrow window. They learned not to plan far ahead. They learned to focus on the next task. This made them resilient. It also made them tired. By adolescence, many children carried a kind of weariness that didn't belong to their age. Not sadness, just familiarity. Familiarity with effort, with vigilance, with adjusting expectations. They did not think of childhood as something lost, because they had never known it as something separate. It was simply the beginning of participation. Participation in work, in risk, in survival. And so, when they became adults, they did not look back and mourn their childhoods. They replicated them, because replication felt safe. It was known. They trusted what had worked, even if it had worked imperfectly. This is how fragile systems endure, not because they are ideal, but because they are familiar. Children born into these systems do not experience them as harsh. They experience them as normal, and normal is powerful. Normal shapes expectation. Normal defines what feels possible. So medieval childhood did not need to be defended. It did not need to be justified. It simply existed. And most children, quietly, statistically, predictably, did not make it through. Not because anyone wanted it that way, but because the margin was always too thin, and thinning margins leave little room for error. A cup of water, not a special one. Not clean in the way we'd mean it now. Just water, poured because someone was thirsty. In many homes, children drank from whatever was closest. The same cup, the same bowl. It was efficient, and efficiency mattered more than precision. No one inspected water before giving it to a child. You trusted the source because you had to. Children learned early which water tasted different, which made the stomach twist later. They didn't know why. They just remembered. A child who had been sick once learned to hesitate. Not long, just enough. But hesitation doesn't always help, because thirst returns, and water is everywhere. Rivers cut through towns, ditches ran beside paths, wells opened into darkness. Children passed these places daily. They crossed planks, they balanced stones. At first, an adult watched, then less often, because watching takes time, and time is expensive. Soon, a child knew the route well enough to walk it alone. That knowledge felt like permission. They walked faster. They took shortcuts. And shortcuts are where accidents live. A rope at a well frays slowly. No one notices it all at once. Hands grip it daily. Buckets go up and down. It holds until it doesn't. A child pulling water doesn't know the rope's history. They trust it because everyone else has. And when it gives way, the fall is sudden. There is no warning. People later say it was unfortunate, that the rope had held for years, which is true, but not helpful. These moments don't feel dramatic when they happen. They feel confusing. A child goes to do something ordinary and does not return. Someone notices the absence before the cause, because the task should have been quick. This is how many dangers worked. They hid inside normality. Fire did the same. A pot left near the edge. A spark that jumped further than expected. Children knew fire was dangerous. But knowing something is dangerous doesn't tell you when it will hurt you. So they learned through proximity. They learned how close was too close. Sometimes accurately, sometimes not. The thing about fire is that it forgives many mistakes until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, the lesson is permanent. Surviving children carried marks. Scars were common. They were not hidden. They were not explained. They were simply there, part of the body, part of growing up. Animals taught similar lessons. A child who had been kicked once learned to watch legs more carefully. A child who had been bitten learned to read teeth. No one taught them this. The animals did, slowly, painfully, and children adapted, because adaptation was expected. When a child was injured but lived, the injury became part of their usefulness. A burned hand still worked just differently. A limp slowed you down, but not enough to stop you. Children learned to compensate, to adjust tasks, to avoid drawing attention to weakness. Weakness invited concern, but also scrutiny, and scrutiny was uncomfortable. So children learned to be quiet about pain, not because they were brave, but because pain was common. Complaining too often made you unreliable, and reliability mattered. This is another quiet rule. A child who was dependable was kept. A child who was not might be moved. So children learned endurance early, not heroically, practically. They learned that discomfort was temporary. That danger passed, usually, and when it didn't, others adjusted. The household adapted around the loss. A new routine formed. This constant adjustment created a strange stability. Things changed often, but the pattern of change stayed the same. Children lived inside that pattern. They expected instability. They planned for interruption, which meant that even calm periods felt provisional. A peaceful day was enjoyed, but not trusted. This is why medieval childhood feels both intense and muted. So much happened, and yet so little was said. Children learn not to narrate their lives. They lived them quietly, step by step, until one day, without ceremony, they were no longer the smallest in the room. someone younger appeared, someone who needed watching, and the cycle shifted again. Now they were the ones saying, "Stay back, be careful, don't go there," repeating words they had once obeyed, words that had never felt like protection, but now sounded like it, and they meant them. Some children did not stay. They were not lost. They were not forgotten. They were placed, lifted from one routine and set gently, sometimes roughly, into another. This was called being saved. At first, it looked like safety. A roof that didn't leak as much, food that arrived at regular hours, hands whose only job was care. For a moment, it felt like margin, but margin is fragile. Places that took children in were never meant to hold so many. They were created for emergencies, a night, a crisis, a single desperate decision. And then more children arrived, and more. Because once a place existed, people learned to use it. Quietly, a mother who could not keep a child now had somewhere to go. A household under pressure now had a release. No one celebrated this. It simply happened. The building filled. Cradles lined up. Names recorded. Sometimes the names mattered. Sometimes they didn't. Children were fed, cleaned, moved. Efficiency crept in. Care became routine. Routine became speed. And speed, while useful, has little patience. Infants cried. Some were answered quickly, some were not. Not because no one cared, but because care was rationed. Milk did not multiply just because more mouths appeared. So systems formed. Wet nurses were hired, then stretched. One infant became two, two became three. Each one still fed, just less carefully. No one planned this. It was a solution layered onto another solution. Temporary fixes stacked until the weight changed their shape. Children who survived these places learned something early. They learned how to wait without being noticed. They learned that crying did not always bring comfort, so they cried less. Or they learned to cry in ways that worked. Short cries, timed cries. They learned that stillness was rewarded. And stillness became habit. Children who were later sent out into service, into households, into work carried this with them. They were adaptable, quiet, low maintenance, highly desirable, not because they were happy, but because they fit, and fitting meant survival. This is the uncomfortable part. The children who did best were often the ones who asked for least. The system favored them, and so it reproduced them. Those who struggled often disappeared from the records, because systems rarely document failure well. They document throughput. Back outside the walls, people spoke of these places with gratitude. They existed. That was enough. No one asked too closely how well they worked, because asking might reveal answers no one had the capacity to address. So belief filled the gap. Belief that care was happening. Belief that intention mattered more than outcome. And belief, like everything else, became habit. Children inside these systems did not question them. They adapted. They always did. And when they grew old enough to leave, they carried the same understanding they had learned everywhere else. That safety was conditional. That kindness was finite. That routine mattered more than comfort. They did not expect permanence. They expected continuity, which is a different thing entirely. This is how rescue blended seamlessly into the larger pattern of medieval childhood. It did not interrupt it. It fed it. Another place where children learned how to survive. by becoming easy to keep alive. And when those children became adults, they did not see these systems as failures. They saw them as necessary because they had lived through them. And survival always feels like success, even when it is narrow. Night was supposed to be rest. In theory, in practice, it was simply when movement slowed. The house did not become safe when the sun went down. It only became quieter. Children slept where there was space, near walls, near warmth, near other bodies. Privacy was not a concept that applied here. Sleep was communal, breath mixed, heat pooled. This was efficient. One fire warmed many people. One room was easier to watch than several. And for most nights, it worked. Children learned the sounds of sleep, the shift of bodies, the crackle of dying embers, the cough that meant nothing, and the one that didn't. They slept lightly, not because they were anxious, but because light sleep was adaptive. A child who slept too deeply might not wake when moved, might not cry when something pressed too close. So stillness became shallow. Even rest was conditional. Infants were laid where they could be reached quickly, sometimes too quickly. An adult arm thrown out in sleep, a blanket pulled tighter against cold. No one intended harm. That's what makes it difficult to talk about. Danger didn't come from malice. It came from proximity, from closeness that was necessary and risky. And when something went wrong at night, it was often discovered too late. Morning arrived as usual. Light entered the room. Someone noticed that a child had not stirred, and the day began differently. But it still began. This is another quiet truth. Night did not reset risk. It condensed it. Fire burned lower, but remained dangerous. Animals shifted in their sleep. Breath slowed. Children survived night by being unnoticed, by staying where they were put, by not moving too much. And those who learned this survived more often. This lesson carried forward. Children learned to make themselves small, not metaphorically, physically, to curl, to tuck in. They learned how to fit into spaces meant for others. They learned how not to disturb. This skill followed them into life, into service, into work. The ability to exist without drawing attention was prized, especially in crowded households, especially in institutions. Sleep became something you did lightly, briefly, ready to wake, ready to move. This is why rest never fully restored. Even children who lived long enough to grow tall carried fatigue early. Not exhaustion, just readiness. Always prepared for interruption, because interruption was common. A cry, a noise outside, a sudden need. Night taught children the same thing day did. That safety was temporary. That quiet did not mean secure. That survival depended on awareness, even when you were supposed to be asleep. And then morning came. Again, the fire was stirred. Water was fetched. Children woke and moved as if nothing had happened, because nothing had, and that was normal. This repetition shaped memory. Children didn't remember single nights. They remembered patterns, and patterns felt inevitable. So when they later placed their own children to sleep, they repeated the same arrangements. Close, warm, efficient. They worried, but not enough to change things, because change felt riskier than familiarity. They trusted what had worked before, even if it had worked imperfectly. This is how danger becomes tradition, not through ignorance, but through repetition. And children born into this repetition did not question it. They learned to sleep the way they were taught, lightly, quietly, alive in the morning, or not. And if not, the house adjusted. Always. The children who survived were not the strongest. Not necessarily. They were the ones who fit into routines, fit into expectations, fit into spaces that were never designed with them in mind. Survival favored those who learned when to move and when not to. A child who survived learned how to read a room before entering it. They sensed tension the way others sensed weather. They noticed when voices dropped, when movements became sharper. They learned when to step aside. This wasn't fear, it was calibration. They adjusted themselves constantly, a little quieter here, a little faster there. They learned how to disappear into usefulness, which sounds strange until you realize how valuable that was. A useful child was protected, not actively, not emotionally, but structurally. They were kept, fed, placed. A child who caused trouble, even unintentionally, introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty was dangerous. So children learned to smooth themselves, to soften edges, to anticipate needs before they were spoken. This created children who felt older than they were, not wiser, just practiced. They had been practicing survival since they could walk, and this practice shaped them. It made them observant, efficient. It also made them quiet, not silent, but economical. They spoke when it mattered. They didn't waste effort. Effort was precious. This is one of the reasons medieval childhood feels so thin when we try to grasp it. There is no excess, no room for experimentation. Everything is directed toward continuity. Even play, when it happens, imitates adult life. Children play at work, at trade, at caregiving. They rehearse usefulness, not because someone tells them to, but because that's what they see. And imitation is how learning happens. A child who survives long enough begins to internalize the idea that survival is earned, not morally, practically. If you contribute, you stay. If you don't, things become uncertain. This belief is not articulated. It settles in quietly. It becomes instinct. So, when these children grow into adolescence, they don't rebel in the way we might expect. They don't resist responsibility. Responsibility feels like safety. It feels like belonging. Belonging in this world is conditional, and they know it. This is why medieval societies could rely on young people so heavily. Not because they were forced, but because they had already learned that participation was protection. A child who had watched siblings disappear did not need to be told this. They had seen what absence looked like. They had seen how quickly spaces were filled. They understood replacement. This knowledge is unsettling, but it is also stabilizing. It teaches you not to cling too tightly, to accept movement, to expect change. And so medieval childhood produced adults who were adaptable, not optimistic, not hopeful in the modern sense, but steady. They didn't expect life to improve dramatically. They expected it to continue, and continuation was success. This mindset softened disappointment. It also limited aspiration. But aspiration is a luxury, and luxury requires margin. Margin was rare, so children grew into adults who planned for disruption, who trusted systems only partially, who prepared for loss instinctively. And then they had children, and without realizing it, they began again. They didn't sit down and decide to recreate the same conditions. They simply used what they knew. They wrapped They watched. They sent children out early, because that was what survival had looked like. Temporary solutions, inherited as wisdom, improvisations, passed down as care, and children born into this world did not experience it as harsh. They experienced it as familiar. They did not mourn the absence of safety. They never expected it. They learned early that life was something you navigated, carefully, quietly, with attention, and if you did that well enough, you might make it through. There is a moment that doesn't look important. It doesn't announce itself. A child pauses. That's all. They don't step forward. They don't reach out. They just stop. Maybe it's near water. Maybe near fire. Maybe it's nothing at all. But something in them hesitates. They've seen this before, or something like it. They don't know what will happen if they move, but they know enough not to. And in that pause, something shifts, not visibly, not dramatically, but that pause is not play. It's calculation. Children aren't supposed to calculate. Not like this. Not this early. But medieval childhood doesn't wait for readiness. It introduces risk first and explanation later. Sometimes never. So children learn through proximity. They learn by watching what happens when others don't pause. A fall, a shout, a sudden silence. They connect these things without words. They don't need to understand cause the way adults do. They just need to know what to avoid. And avoidance becomes instinct. This is how caution settles into the body, not fear, something quieter, a habit of slowing down, of observing first, of choosing stillness over curiosity. This habit follows children everywhere, into work, into service, into relationships. They learn to read before they act. They wait for cues. They sense when something is about to go wrong. This makes them good at surviving. It also makes them careful with joy. Joy involves movement, noise, exposure. So joy becomes brief, contained, a laugh that stops quickly, a game that stays close to the house. Children don't stop enjoying things. They just enjoy them cautiously. They enjoy them as if something might interrupt at any moment, because something usually does. And interruption shapes memory. Children remember what ends things, not what begins them. They remember the shout that stopped the game, the sound that meant trouble. So they anticipate endings, even before they arrive. This is why medieval childhood feels like it's always leaning forward, not toward the future, toward the next adjustment, the next correction, the next thing that must be navigated. Time doesn't open up, it compresses. Moments are short, attention is sharp, and children adapt to that rhythm. They become good at small decisions, where to stand, when to speak, how close is too close. These are not skills anyone praises. They are simply expected, and expectation is powerful. It shapes behavior more effectively than instruction. By the time children reach an age where others rely on them, they are already prepared. Not because they were trained, but because they were conditioned by repetition. This is why medieval childhood leaves so few traces. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't linger. It moves quietly into adulthood, carrying habits instead of memories. And those habits shape the next generation. A parent watches a child pause. They don't comment on it. They feel relief, because a child who pauses is a child who might survive. They don't name this thought. They don't need to. It lives underneath everything. So the child is not encouraged to rush. They are not urged to explore freely. They are guided subtly toward caution, toward usefulness, toward fitting in. And fitting in, once again, becomes safety. The pause repeats, generation after generation, in different places, different households, always unremarked, always effective. And slowly, quietly, that pause replaces play. Not entirely, but enough. Enough that childhood never fully unfolds. It folds instead into work, into awareness, into survival. And the world keeps moving because it has learned how to move this way. Some deaths did not leave marks, no scars, no stories. They happened in the same way many days happened, quietly, between tasks, without witnesses who knew what they were witnessing. A child felt tired, then weaker, then still. There was no fall, no fire, no water rushing, just a body that stopped keeping up. These were the deaths that were hardest to remember, not because they mattered less, but because they looked like everything else. A child who faded did not interrupt the day. They occupied a corner. They were checked occasionally. Someone touched a forehead. Someone said, "They're warm," or "They're cold." And then the work continued. When the end came, it felt less like an event, and more like a conclusion that had been forming quietly for a while. These children did not get explanations. They did not get lessons attached to them. No one said, "This is what happens if," because there was nothing obvious to point to, no mistake, no warning that could be corrected next time, which made these deaths unsettling. They resisted logic. So people learned not to dwell on them. They accepted them as part of the background, a kind of static. Children noticed this too. They noticed which deaths were spoken about and which ones were not. The drowning was mentioned. The burn was remembered. But the child who simply did not wake up, they slipped out of memory faster. Not because no one cared, but because there was nothing to hold on to, no shape to the loss. And children learned from this. They learned that some dangers could be avoided, and some could not. They learned that vigilance had limits, that you could do everything right and still not make it. This knowledge didn't frighten them constantly. It settled more quietly than that. It became acceptance, a sense that life did not owe you consistency. So children learned to take things as they came. A good day was enjoyed, but not invested in. A healthy stretch was appreciated, but not trusted. This created a particular relationship with time. Children lived very much in the present, not mindfully, necessarily. Planning far ahead required confidence that tomorrow would resemble today. That confidence was rare, so instead, attention stayed close, on the next step, the next task, the next moment where a pause might matter. This is why medieval childhood feels so narrow when you try to picture it. There are no long arcs, no extended anticipation, just a sequence of adjustments, small recalibrations. Children grew up fluent in these adjustments. They knew how to respond when something went wrong. They had seen it happen. They had watched adults move on. They knew what was expected of them, which was not understanding, but continuation. And continuation became the highest value. Not happiness, not fulfillment, just staying, staying alive, staying useful, staying part of the pattern. This value shaped everything. It shaped how children were mourned, how they were replaced, how they were remembered if at all. It also shaped how children saw themselves. They did not assume they were irreplaceable. They did not assume permanence. They learned early that places refill, that roles continue, that life rearranges itself quickly. This awareness didn't make them bitter. It made them adaptable. It made them cautious about taking up space. It made them skilled at slipping into gaps. And gaps were everywhere. In households stretched thin, in workshops, in fields. There was always a place for someone who could fit. So children learned to fit, to fold themselves around needs, to accept inconvenience without protest, because protest risked removal, and removal was dangerous. So they stayed quietly, carefully, inside the margins, and the margins were where medieval childhood lived. Children were not rare. That's the first thing to understand. They were everywhere. In houses, in fields, under tables, in doorways. Someone was always pregnant. Someone had just given birth. Someone had just buried a small body. These things happened close together. So close, in fact, that they overlapped. A woman might still be bleeding from childbirth, while another child was already being carried on her hip. No one stopped to count. Counting was pointless. Children arrived, because that's what happened. When people married and slept and survived long enough, no one asked how many. That question belongs to a world with control. This world had endurance instead. So families had many children, not because they were optimistic, but because they were realistic. They knew some would not stay. This was not whispered. It wasn't hidden. It lived openly in the way people behaved. They didn't say, "When you grow up," they said, "If you grow up." And children heard that difference early, very early. It shaped how they saw themselves. A child understood, without being told, that they were not a guarantee. They were a possibility. And possibilities are handled carefully, not gently, carefully. This is where the dark humor slips in. Because adults didn't ignore child death. They prepared for it. They named children after relatives, and sometimes after siblings who had died before them. Not symbolically, practically. Names were reused, the way clothes were reused. Nothing was wasted if it could still function. A child might grow up knowing they carried the name of someone who hadn't made it. No one explained this. They figured it out, and when they did, it didn't horrify them. It normalized something. It taught them that identity was flexible, that places could be refilled. That absence was manageable. This sounds cruel, but it made a strange kind of sense. Because in a world where death visited often, you didn't build your entire future around one small body. That would be reckless. So families spread their hope, not emotionally, biologically. More children meant more chances, not more joy, more chances. Children understood this too. They felt it in the way attention moved. A sick child received care, but the household did not stop. A dead child was mourned, but the next meal was still cooked. Life did not pause to honor loss. It stepped around it, and children learnt to step with it. They learned not to center themselves, not to assume permanence. They learned that being alive today did not mean you would be noticed tomorrow, which created a very specific personality. Children became economical. They didn't demand much. They didn't expect long explanations. They accepted conditions, because acceptance was rewarded, and resistance was exhausting. Religion helped with this, not in a poetic way, in a functional way. God gives, God takes. That sentence solved many problems. It allowed adults to keep going. It allowed children to stop asking. If something was God's will, then there was no point in arguing, and children learned quickly which questions had no answers, so they stopped asking them. This wasn't indoctrination, it was efficiency. You can't rebuild your life every time a child dies. So, belief became scaffolding, not comfort, structure, and children grew up inside that structure. They learned that life was conditional, but meaningful anyway. That effort mattered, but outcomes were not guaranteed. That surviving was not proof of virtue, just timing. This is where the humor turns dark, because children noticed patterns. They noticed that careful children survived more often. Quiet children, useful children, children who stayed out of the way. So they tried to be those children, not because they were praised for it, because they saw what happened to the others. A child didn't think, I must be good. They thought, I must not be a problem. And that thought kept them alive. Eventually, they grew up, and when they had children of their own, they didn't sit down and say, we should have many children because mortality is high. They simply lived the pattern. They married. They worked. They slept together. Children arrived. Some stayed. Some didn't. And they adjusted. Again and again. This wasn't cruelty. It was continuity. A system that assumed loss and functioned anyway. And children, small, observant, adaptable, learned how to exist inside it, not loudly, not safely, but effectively. Children learned realism early, not the philosophical kind, the practical kind. They learned not to imagine too far ahead. Imagining required confidence. Confidence required stability. Stability was unreliable. So instead of dreaming about what they would become, children focused on what they were needed for. Needed was safer than wanted. Wanted could disappear. Needed stayed. This is where the tone of childhood shifted. Not suddenly, not sharply, just a slow recalibration. A child stopped asking why and started asking how. How to do this faster. How to stay out of the way. How to be useful without being noticed. This produced a strange kind of humor. Dark, dry, unremarked. Children joked about things that would make adults uncomfortable now. About illness, about death. Not because they were cruel, but because humor made danger manageable. If you could laugh at something, it felt less powerful. A child might joke about being next, not dramatically, almost casually, and adults would not always correct them, because everyone understood what they meant. This humor didn't erase fear. It organized it. It turned something overwhelming into something familiar, and familiarity was comforting. In households where many children had been born, comparisons happened quietly, not out loud, but children noticed. They noticed who was watched more closely, who was allowed to rest, who was trusted. They noticed that some children were treated as more promising, not because they were loved more, but because they seemed likely to last. This awareness changed behavior. Children tried to resemble survivors. They copied the habits of older siblings who had made it through illness. They listened carefully to stories of accidents and remembered what not to do. This is where childhood became instructional, not through lessons, through observation. Every loss became data. Every survival became confirmation. And children absorbed it all. Quietly, by adolescence, many children were already deeply practical. They did not romanticize adulthood. They did not expect ease. They expected responsibility. Responsibility felt like safety, because responsibility meant you mattered, even if only functionally. This shaped how children viewed their own worth. Worth was not inherent. It was demonstrated through work, through endurance, through compliance. That sounds bleak, but it also created resilience. Children who grew up this way did not collapse easily. They did not expect fairness. So disappointment did not surprise them. They adjusted. Again, this adjustment became the defining motion of medieval childhood. Adjust to loss, adjust to scarcity, adjust to danger, and always adjust quietly, because drawing attention rarely helped. This is why medieval childhood left so few loud memories. It did not shout. It did not protest. It adapted. And in adapting, it survived. Sometimes. Enough to keep the system running. Enough to bring the next generation into the same rhythm. And those children, born into a world already shaped by loss, did not experience it as tragedy. They experienced it as baseline, as normal, as the way things were done, which is perhaps the darkest humor of all, that something so severe could feel so ordinary. There were jokes that only made sense if you had already seen too much. Children learned them early. They weren't told outright. They overheard them. A remark muttered while digging a grave that was too small. A half smile when someone said, "This one looks strong." Strong meant something very specific. It didn't mean brave. It didn't mean clever. It meant still here. A child learned quickly that being described as strong was not praise. It was assessment. Adults didn't say it kindly. They said it the way you check a rope before trusting it. Children noticed this. They noticed how adults looked at them during illness, not with panic, with calculation. Is this serious? Is this worth rearranging things for? That sounds cruel when said directly, but it wasn't thought that way. It was triage. Households ran on triage. Energy went where it had the best chance of returning. And children understood this logic without ever naming it. They adjusted their behavior accordingly. A child who felt weak might hide it, not out of shame, out of instinct. Weakness risked being moved aside. So children learned to perform wellness, to eat even when they weren't hungry, to stand even when they were dizzy, not heroically, practically. This is where the dark humor deepened. A child who survived a bad illness might joke about it later, not to process trauma, but to signal something. I made it. That was the punchline, and everyone understood it. Sometimes children joked about siblings who hadn't, not cruelly, briefly, as if naming it quickly made it less heavy. Adults didn't always stop this. They understood that humor was doing work. It was containing something too large to carry openly. Laughing didn't mean they didn't care. It meant they cared enough to keep functioning. Children grew up watching this emotional economy. They learned when emotion was allowed and when it had to be folded away. Grief happened, but it happened efficiently. A child learned that crying was acceptable for a while. Then the crying had to stop, because bread still needed to be made, animals still needed tending, and life did not negotiate with sorrow. This taught children something uncomfortable but useful, that feelings were real, but optional. You could feel them later, if later came. So children prioritized presence over processing. Being there mattered more than understanding why. This shaped the way they remembered things. They remembered events as facts, not stories. He fell, she didn't wake up, the baby was gone. No embellishment, no emotional framing, just information. Information was safer. It didn't pull you under. By the time children reached an age where they could reflect, they had already learned not to linger. They didn't revisit memories. They didn't analyze them. They carried them quietly, like tools. You don't think about tools. You just use them. This is why medieval childhood feels emotionally distant to us. Not because emotion was absent, but because it was compressed, reduced to a size that could be carried without breaking the person. Children became experts at this compression, and adults relied on them to be. A child who could keep going was valued. A child who could adapt was protected, not because they were loved more, but because they were easier to keep alive. This sounds bleak. It is, but it also explains something important. Why medieval societies didn't collapse under the weight of loss. They built people who could absorb it, quietly, efficiently, with just enough humor to keep it from crushing them. Not jokes that made you laugh, jokes that let you breathe. And children learned them early, too early. And yet, childhood did not disappear. That's the strange part. With all this danger, all this loss, all this restraint, children still laughed. Not constantly, not freely, but unmistakably. They played in small bursts, between tasks, between errands, between moments when someone wasn't watching too closely. Games didn't need equipment. A stone, a stick, a shadow on a wall. Play happened where it could fit. And that tells you something important. Because play is not evidence of comfort. It's evidence of pressure. Children don't play because life is easy. They play because life is heavy. And play is how the weight shifts for a moment. Medieval children didn't play despite hardship. They played inside it. They laughed quickly because laughter that lasts too long attracts attention. They ran short distances because there was always somewhere else to be. They imagined briefly because imagination without limits felt dangerous. And still, imagination existed. That's the contradiction. A world that produced children who were cautious, practical, alert, also produced children who could invent joy out of almost nothing. Not big joy, not hopeful joy, but enough to keep going, enough to remind them they were still alive. This is what modern eyes often miss. We look at medieval childhood and see only loss. But loss alone does not explain survival. What explains survival is adaptation. Children learned when to pause, and when it was safe to laugh. They learned when to be still, and when to move. They learned how to live just enough. And that's the real contrast. Not innocence versus cruelty, but fragility versus persistence. Medieval childhood was fragile, extremely, and yet it endured. Not beautifully, not gently, but effectively. Children were not protected from the world. They were trained quietly to live in it, and many did not make it. But those who did carried something forward, not trauma in the modern sense, something simpler, a knowledge of limits, a familiarity with change, an understanding that life continues whether you are ready or not. That knowledge shaped everything that came after: families, work, tradition, and, eventually, the world that replaced it. Not better, not worse, just different. And somewhere inside that difference, this version of childhood faded. not because it was remembered and rejected, but because conditions finally changed enough that it was no longer necessary.